Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to make sure that we honor everyone's time and finish up at a reasonable time today. So I wanted to thank everybody for showing up and attending the webinar today. This presentation is going to provide EPPs with an introduction to the revisions to 19 Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 228, that were adopted by the State Board for Educator Certification, or SBEC, in February 2024. This presentation is intended to be an introduction, including responses to some of the frequently asked questions around the Chapter 228 makeover. There will be additional training and supports that are more specific at a future date. TEA staff will include information about future training and supports in the EPP newsletter. I am Lori Ayers, and I am happy to be your presenter today. I have lived with EPPs in Chapter 228 for the last decade, and I have seen, as you have, the opportunities for improvement. So it is with great enthusiasm that I deliver this debut to you today. This presentation is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Program Provider Resources page on the TEA website. Please feel free to share the link as a resource with your EPP colleagues. In today's presentation, we will orient to the layout of the new Chapter 228 and review a few key updates. Please note, I will not be able to identify all updates today, so I encourage you to review closely the new Chapter 228. Hopefully, after this orientation, you will feel confident to review the chapter on your own. Additionally, I will respond to some of the questions that TEA has received and identify some next steps. The first draft of the Chapter 228 makeover began long before February 2023. However, the draft made its debut as a discussion item at the February 2023 SBEC meeting. It was carried through the April, July, and September 2023 SBEC meetings as a discussion item, giving stakeholders and the SBEC ample opportunity to weigh in with comments and suggested refinements. All of the input and advisement was very helpful in developing a product that is user-friendly and elevates the quality and consistency of educator preparation. In other words, the result of the makeover is a beautiful chapter. All of these changes will be reviewed by the SBOE in April, and we hope to have their enthusiastic support for these upgrades. Following that, the implementation date for the new Chapter 228 will be September 1st, 2024. TEA received so much input from stakeholders across the year and made so many revisions and refinements based on that ongoing input that to track transparently refinements for all stakeholders, TEA staff had to implement a color scheme to track the evolution and/or addition of requirements. This key appeared in the discussion item for the September 29th, 2023 SBEC meeting. You will hear some terms today that may need some clarification. When I refer to route, I'm referring to the undergraduate, post-baccalaureate, alternative, or residency route to certification. An EPP may be approved to offer one route or multiple routes. The term class is referring to the different certificate classes that an EPP could be approved to offer. The possible classes are teacher, principal, superintendent, educational diagnostician, school counselor, school librarian, and reading specialist. Specifically, when speaking about any class except teacher, I will use the term non-teacher classes, which includes principal, superintendent, educational diagnostician, school counselor, school librarian, and reading specialist. You have seen the term clinical experience in ACEP. That is the collective term for clinical teaching, internship, practicum, and residency. FBE, or field-based experience, is different from the clinical experience. FBE hours are the hours completed by teacher candidates in K-12 classrooms as part of pre-service coursework and training. FBE are completed before the clinical experience. And finally, the term DBA is short for doing business as, and is used in Chapter 228 in the context of names an EPP may use that are not original SBEC approved EPP names. An example of an EPP that may have a DBA is the Region 4 Education Service Center. Their approved EPP name is Region 4 Education Service Center, but they use Inspire, Texas as their EPP name. So they are doing business as Inspire, Texas. And thanks to Region 4 for being the subject of my example. As we stroll through the features in 228, you will likely have questions. Please add your questions to the question feature in the GoToWebinar toolbar. TEA staff will capture the questions from this webinar and from future sources and use them to create an FAQ that will ultimately be posted on the Program Provider Resources page for reference as we move forward with implementation. Please note that chat will not be monitored today, and questions placed in chat will be lost when the webinar ends. So please use the question feature to record your questions. The original goals for the Chapter 228 makeover were these. First, improved navigation and user friendliness were goals to improve the readability so it would be easier for users to find what they need within the chapter. Additional goals were responsive to comments and questions over time from EPPs, to define more terms used in Chapter 228, and to clarify wording that was vague. This includes additional clarification for rules that apply to non-teacher certificate classes. And finally, additional goals were to elevate quality in preparation across the state through implementing elements of the effective preparation framework and to add flexibility where needed for EPPs to implement requirements. For a more user-friendly Chapter 228, the chapter was subdivided. This big beast of a chapter required 7 subdivisions. We call these subchapters. The titles of the subchapters help direct the reader to the sections of interest. So no more scrolling through the whole chapter to find a section. One thing to remember as we go through these subchapters and related updates today is that much of what happened in Chapter 228's makeover was reorganization. That massive change makes it appear as if the contents of the chapter have also been changed. Some have been changed, and some new requirements have been added. But many of the requirements have not changed. They're just living in a new subdivision, are easier to find and read, and thus may have a new look. Let's now take a quick trip through each subchapter and orient you to what is in each. I will hit some highlights in each with the understanding that I will not be able to cover them all today. You can complete a close read of each subchapter on your own later. Subchapter A contains general guidance. A couple of these section citations are the same as in the repealed version of Chapter 228. You will note the definitions are still 228.2, so that's one less new citation to memorize, which you will appreciate more once you see the sweeping reorganization and the related new citations as we get farther into the subchapters. One of the key updates to this subchapter is the expanded definition section from 36 definitions to 53 definitions. You will see some new definitions and some improved definitions. These are the results of ongoing comments from EPPs and also from new provisions. You will also find the implementation of the requirements in the new Chapter 228, identified as September 1st, 2024. As mentioned previously, TEA has had much input from stakeholders on this Chapter 228 makeover and continues to receive questions over various topics. Throughout this presentation today, I will highlight some questions or comments TEA has received on the contents of each subchapter. These will likely trigger more questions, so please capture them in the question feature on the GoToWebinar toolbar so TEA staff can respond to them at a later time. Responses will ultimately be published in an FAQ document so everyone can benefit from the responses to all of your questions. One definition that has received frequent questions and comments has been that of authentic school setting. This definition was added in relation to early field-based experience, or FBE, which are pre-service requirements for teacher candidates. This definition does not apply to clinical experiences such as clinical teaching, internship, practicum, or residency. The definition establishes that a candidate cannot count professional development, extracurricular activities, work days when students are not present, or before or after school childcare or tutoring as FBE. Additionally, the definition builds in long requested flexibility to now allow FBE to be completed in summer school. The definitions of permanent substitute and substitute teacher also relate to FBE requirements. Substitute teaching was added as a flexibility for completing FBE hours. So the term had to be defined to distinguish it from the permanent substitute definition, which is existing statutory flexibility in FBE requirements. And finally, there have been lots of questions about implementation of the adopted Chapter 228. The implementation date is September 1st, 2024, and the new requirements would not apply to candidates who have already completed those specific requirements under the current rules. Strolling along to the next subchapter, B. This subchapter contains the approval rules. These include rules for entities and individuals seeking SBEC approval as a new EPP, the 5-year continuing approval review process, and additional approvals such as those for adding certificates to inventory or approval for a candidate to complete the clinical experience outside of Texas. EPPs will find program rules around amendments here as well. Program amendments include significant changes to approved EPP processes, such as moving a face-to-face program to an online delivery, or adding an alternative certification route to a university-based EPP that is already approved for undergraduate and post-bac routes, and so forth. One key update that will impact all EPPs in this section is the updated evidence figure. This figure was shortened and streamlined over the previous figure to help EPPs know what type of documentation should be retained as evidence a candidate has met admission requirements and completed all certification requirements. TEA staff have identified the evidence figure as the subject of a short, separate training in the future. The updated figure is intended to provide increased clarity and increased flexibility in order to streamline EPP record keeping. As most everyone knows, probably the biggest lift in the Chapter 228 makeover is the addition of the new residency route and the related requirements that you will see scattered throughout all subchapters, including Subchapter A that we just looked at. For those EPPs who want to offer a residency route, the application requirements are in Subchapter B. By the way, for EPPs seeking to implement a residency route, your application must be approved by the SBEC, similar to the process for approving a new certificate class. We will touch on residency again throughout this presentation, but as you are listening, keep in mind residency is optional and is not required for EPPs. Misunderstandings about residency requirements have caused a bit of heartburn for some EPPs. So I just wanted to clarify now that residency is not required for EPPs. As is pictured here, one question that TEA continues to receive is, does my EPP have to implement a residency model? The answer is no, it is not required. While it is a highly effective preparation model, the EPP will decide whether to adopt the model or not. EPPs have ongoing questions related to evidence and EPP documentation. As mentioned previously, TEA staff plan to hold a special separate training around the evidence figure. But for now, note the suggested evidence has not changed. Only the figure was clarified, cleaned up, and compacted. And as stated above, there is no change to observation reporting. Informal observations are not reported in ECOS. Continuing our stroll through Chapter 228 makeover, we come to Subchapter C, which is about program administration and governance. You will find in this subchapter the advisory committee rules, as well as the rules for programs that change ownership or want a name change, and rules for programs that close a certification class or close the whole program. Note the program closure rules have been more clearly defined with the goal of minimizing the impact of closure on candidates processing through the EPP at the time of closure. These are some key updates that would be of interest to most of the people attending this presentation today. The update to section 228.21 for closing programs may not impact your EPP at this moment, but you never know when the EPP may decide to close out a certificate area. EPPs will find those rules updated and easy to understand for that process. And Houston Christian University, the next one is for you. The name change rules are updated to allow an EPP at a university to change name if the university changes name. So HCU, when this is implemented, your EPP will be able to initiate the name change. At that time, please reach out to your assigned specialist for assistance on that name change. There is a residency-related update here for those EPPs who plan to seek SBEC approval to offer a residency route. And we previously talked about a DBA name. To help consumers find the EPPs will be required to notify TEA annually of your DBA name. This is a common question TEA receives from EPPs. This update answers the question. Subchapter D is about required coursework and training. This is a pretty meaty subchapter with more sections than previous subchapters we've looked at. This subchapter contains the curriculum requirements that were previously in section 228.30, such as the dyslexia training requirement, the digital literacy requirement, and the requirement that curriculum must be standards-based. Additionally, there are some requirements here that were previously in section 228.35 in the repealed chapter 228, such as the number of coursework and training hours required. For example, 300 hours for teacher candidates, 200 hours for non-teacher candidates, and so forth. This subchapter also contains the pre-service requirements for teacher candidates, which we all recognize as the prescribed 150 hours of coursework plus FBE hours. There is a section containing requirements for late hires that was in the previous section 228.35 as well. Additionally, this subchapter has what I think of as carve-outs for additional certificates that may have unique coursework requirements, such as the pre-K through 3 certificate and the new deafblind supplemental EC12 certificate. These are some key updates to coursework requirements in Subchapter D and may require some preparation on the part of some EPPs that do not already have these structures in place. The section 228.31 identifies EPP obligations to all candidates. I do really like the way this section is put together. Note the exit policy that previously resided in the governance section in the repealed Chapter 228 now resides here. Also note the exit policy has been tweaked and requires EPPs to add a policy for exiting inactive candidates after 2 years of inactivity. Added flexibility allows university-based programs to adopt their university policy, which some programs have already done. The second bullet clarifies that if the EPP approves a candidate to change to a new certificate area, the candidate must receive preparation in the new area. TEA receives a surprising number of questions around candidates changing certificate areas after admission. So hopefully the revisions to the requirements add clarification for EPPs and their candidates. Based on recommendations from multiple EPPs, the number of required FBE hours has been increased from 30 to 50 to meet teacher pre-service requirements. And then responsively, the number of interactive FBE has changed from 15 hours to 25 hours. Responsive to these updated requirements, new flexibilities have been added for how candidates may complete FBE hours. Another update to pre-service requirements is for EPPs to provide instruction to pre-service teacher candidates on implementing open education instructional materials. This is another area TEA staff have identified where EPPs may want some additional training. Finally, the late hire rules have been clarified to acknowledge that a candidate would no longer qualify for an internship assignment if pre-service coursework is not complete within the 90 days allowed, which would require the intern or probationary certificate to then be deactivated. Many of the questions and comments received about the Chapter 228 makeover have been related to FBE activities. Remember, only teacher candidates are required to complete FBE hours, and they must be completed pre-service, which means before the candidate begins the clinical experience. Questions have mostly been focused on the number of hours and the flexibility in completing those hours. As mentioned previously, the 30 hours required has been increased to 50 hours. During continuing approval reviews, we have seen that some EPPs already require more hours than the minimum. Additional updates include clarification and added flexibility for completing the required hours. As mentioned earlier, the definition of authentic school setting for FBE was revised to include summer school, which allows candidates to complete FBE in summer school. This is responsive to ongoing requests from some EPPs. TEA receives many questions about the nature of the interactive hours. These examples, such as small group or whole class instruction, in-class tutoring or one-on-one student support, etc., have been added as helpful suggestions for interactive hours, but they're not an exhaustive list. Additionally, added flexibility for completing the remaining 25 hours, which I will call flexible hours, includes service as a substitute teacher, service as an educational aide, and service as a teacher of record. Of note here is that these activities must occur when the candidate is enrolled in the EPP and must meet all requirements for FBE. We're moving along to Subchapter E now, but please remember to post your questions and comments in the questions section of the GoToWebinar toolbar. E is another meaty subchapter. Subchapter E contains requirements and guidance around required clinical experiences for all candidates, teacher and non-teacher classes. The subchapter is structured such that there is a dedicated section for each type of clinical experience, including one for non-teacher programs, which was not always easy to locate in the previous section 228.35 in the repealed version of 228. The educator preparation team at TEA has assisted many non-teacher program staff and candidates with finding the practicum requirements in the repealed version of Chapter 228. So we think you will be as happy as we are to see this new version. The first two sections, 228.61 and 228.63, have some requirements applicable to all clinical experiences, and then the remaining sections are focused on specific clinical experiences, such as 228.67 for clinical teaching requirements, 228.73 for teacher internship requirements, and so forth. You will find the new residency requirements here as well. As with the other subchapters we just reviewed, you will recognize some of the rules that have not changed, but have just found new homes in the new subdivision. But then other rules that have changes or are new, you will find here as well, such as the residency requirement. There are also carve-outs in this subchapter for some certificates that may have unique requirements. Let's now take a look at some highlights of updates to Subchapter E around clinical experience requirements. As mentioned, residency has been added as a clinical experience option. Remember, this is not required and is only available to EPPs who have been approved by the SBEC through the application process. At the request of EPPs, flexibility was added to the duration of clinical teaching by allowing EPPs to calculate the time in hours instead of days. This model is currently being used successfully for candidates completing clinical teaching in educational aid placements. EPPs will appreciate the flexibility this gives to your candidates. Additionally, depth has been added to clinical teaching by requiring co-teaching. This is another area TEA staff have identified where EPPs may want some additional training. The requirements allowing EPPs to extend clinical teaching if needed, and those around ongoing support, are cleanup and clarification. A very important update here is the new section 228.73, item A, which requires the EPP to verify the intern or probationary certificate has issued before the start of the internship. This ensures the district has a qualified teacher in the classroom, and the children in the intern's classroom have a teacher who has been vetted through a fingerprint background check. The lists in the recommendation screens in ECOS for entities can be sorted by application status and can be exported to make it easy for EPPs to track certificates that have issued and those that have not. These are some of the frequently asked questions TEA has received about revisions to this subchapter. As previously mentioned, the change from 70 days to the equivalent 490 hours for clinical teaching was responsive to multiple inquiries post-COVID about added flexibility for teacher candidates. Previously, the rules allowed only full day or half day. Now the days each week may be structured uniquely for a candidate to meet the 490-hour requirement. The protected average 4-hour minimum in the subject and grade band was retained. Finally, we've covered the reasons why we want to verify an intern or probationary certificate as issued prior to the candidate being in the classroom with their K-12 students. I think we can all agree this requirement is a quality addition to this Chapter 228 makeover. These are some of the frequently asked questions TEA has received about revisions to this subchapter related to residencies. Planning periods and professional development are included in the residency hours. The 21 minimum hours that must be completed each week by residents must be with the host teacher. Additionally, TEA has received questions about the assignment start and end dates for residents. The assignment begins and ends on the first and last instructional day in the district where the residency takes place. And as previously identified, the best way to document hours completed is using a log. Let's take a stroll now through Subchapter F. If someone were to ask me which is my favorite part of the Chapter 228 makeover, I would have to say the organization and structure of Subchapters E and F. They do such a great job of organizing the requirements. Subchapter F captures requirements for candidate support during the clinical experience. All of the cooperating teacher, mentor, site supervisor, and field supervisor information that was scattered between definitions and sections 228.35F and G and H in the repealed Chapter 228 are captured in this subchapter. Note here that to save breath and time, I will refer to cooperating teachers, mentors, site supervisors, and the new host teachers collectively as campus support. To further clarify, campus support have always had different names depending on the clinical experience. This is not new. Cooperating teachers support clinical teachers. Mentors support teacher candidates in internships. Site supervisors support non-teacher candidates completing practicums. And the new host teachers support residency candidates. Each of these roles has its own section in this new subchapter. But of course, that means EPPs will have to remember which is which. Additionally, for any type of clinical experience, the EPP must employ field supervisors to provide ongoing support to their candidates and to coach, mentor, and formally and informally observe and evaluate candidates during clinical experiences. Field supervisor requirements are clarified in this section. One thing I like about the organization of the sections in this subchapter is the rules clearly define and distinguish between qualifications and responsibilities for each role. The formal observation schedule is also in Subchapter F, I'm sorry. Recall this information was previously in sections 228.35G and H of the repealed version of Chapter 228. The organization of the sections in Subchapter F makes it very easy to find requirements for the specific type of clinical experience. An important note here is that observation reporting requirements for ACEP have not changed. Programs continue to enter information about all formal observations into ECOS. And observations are entered into ECOS in the reporting year in which the observation occurs. And as in the previous subchapters, this one also has some carve-outs for some certificates that may have unique requirements. The biggest change to the campus support rules was the reorganization. Additions include requirements for host teachers, which is part of the residency updates that are scattered throughout the chapter, and the added flexibility for providing training to campus support. The EPP must provide training to campus support, which has always been required, but within a much smaller window of time. The added flexibility now allows the training to happen within the 12 weeks prior to assignment to a candidate, which allows the EPP to provide training prior to the start of school, which is hopefully a less hectic time for educators. A note about training provided to campus support. Because the training requires training in coaching and mentoring, EPPs are encouraged to offer this as professional development and can provide CPE certificates to attendees. The field supervisor requirements have a few more changes or clarifications than the rules around campus support. The residency requirement was added here as in other subchapters. One update involves clarification and updates to field supervisor training requirements. Field supervisors must receive annual local EPP training and must renew TEA approved training. Two updates to field supervisor requirements that have generated some question and comment are, first, the requirement around TEA approved field supervisor training now requires that training to be renewed every 3 years. The rule allows field supervisors who are currently trained to renew the training by 9/1/2026 and then once per 3 years thereafter. Added flexibility allows field supervisors supporting teacher candidates to waive the TEA approved training if the field supervisor maintains current T-TEST appraiser certification. This is currently allowed, but has been codified for clarification in the Chapter 228 makeover. And second, the requirement for field supervisors to provide informal observations existed in the repealed version of Chapter 228, but has been clarified by adding expectations for how informal observations occur. Field supervisors must now uniformly provide at least 3 informal observations per semester. And finally, an update that is high up on my happy list is the update requiring field supervisors to provide more and earlier support to candidates who are late hires. Remember, late hires are intern teachers in classrooms with minimal training and, as such, would naturally require earlier support and more ongoing support than other interns. Other key updates in Subchapter F will be in the area of formal observations. The number has been increased from 3 to 4 formal observations for clinical teachers and from 3 to 5 for intern teachers holding probationary certificates. The requirement also bumps the first formal observation for intern teachers from 6 weeks to 4 weeks for earlier support for new teachers. Field supervisors will continue to complete formal observations using the pre-conference, observation, post-conference, or POP cycle, and must continue to provide written feedback from the observations to the identified campus support or campus supervisor, as is currently existing in the repealed version of Chapter 228. Note there is flexibility being implemented outside of TAC in the Educator Certification Online System, or ECOS. Validation changes are being prepared that will add flexibility to the parameters around entering observation data to allow for these earlier observations to be entered timely. I do not have more guidance on that yet since it is in development, but TEA staff will come back to you at the beginning of August ASEP webinar and provide information and instruction on the new validations. Remember, enter all formal observations in the reporting year in which they occur. As you can expect, or may know if you have followed the progress of the Chapter 228 makeover, changes to this subchapter have been the subject of much conversation. This slide reflects some key areas that have been addressed. The informal observation requirement has been existing in the repealed version of Chapter 228 for a number of years, so EPPs already have structures in place to support this clarified requirement. It is worth noting that flexibility has been added to the clarified requirement so that after the first face-to-face informal observation, other informals may be conducted virtually, either synchronously or asynchronously. So there are a variety of ways EPPs can approach informal observation. The key for all when implementing is to make these informal observations count so that they elevate quality for your candidate's preparation. TEA staff have identified that EPPs may want some training in how to use informal observations effectively. Note, the EPP may employ anyone who qualifies as a field supervisor and has been trained as a field supervisor to conduct informal observations. And informal observations are not reported in ASEP. However, the evidence of having completed informal observations is retained at the EPP in candidates' records. Based on feedback from EPPs, the observation requirement in 228.105C for clinical teachers needs more clarification, so I have carved it out here for us to look at more closely. First, we must recall that when creating clinical experience records in ECOS, the location of the clinical experience must be identified. The location will be a public school district, charter district, or diocese district, or will be a campus if the assignment is in a standalone private school. Candidates who complete clinical experiences in the same location, even if they are split assignments, such as elementary and secondary, receive the 2+2 observation schedule identified in B of this section. If the split assignment takes them to a new location, then Schedule C is applicable. For example, if a candidate pursuing Art EC12 completes half of the clinical teaching assignment at Clayton Elementary in Austin ISD, and then the second half of the assignment at Bowie High School, also in Austin ISD, the location for that clinical experience has not changed, at least according to the way it's reported in ECOS. Second, candidates who are seeking certification in 2 areas that cannot be observed concurrently in the same class period are required to have the additional observations as required in Schedule C. This is so the EPP can verify proficiency in the standards for each certificate area, which is a requirement elsewhere in the clinical experience rules. And thanks to Austin ISD for being the subject of my example. Finally, we're in Subchapter G, the end of the road for our stroll through the Chapter 228 makeover. This subchapter is one we hope no EPPs ever need to review, since it contains the sections related to formal complaints. To my knowledge, some of you have never received a formal complaint, at least in the last 10 years. Great job. For those EPPs who have received a formal complaint or two, you will notice the reorganization and related new citations in this section. Those are the biggest change to this section, with one additional rule change. Let's take a look. The layout has been subdivided into complaints and investigation procedures and EPP responsibilities for complaints. The key update that EPPs will need to be aware of, should your EPP receive a formal complaint, is the reduction from 21 business days to 10 business days for EPPs to provide responsive information to TEA upon request. The EPP response time was changed from 21 days to 10 days to improve the efficiency of processing formal complaints. It is the experience of the TEA team that processes complaints against EPPs that candidates who file formal complaints against EPPs want to be heard and want a quick resolution so they can move forward and get certified. Quick and efficient responses are helpful to diffuse sometimes volatile situations. Additionally, most EPPs who have had a complaint are eager to get the complaint resolved, and as such, provide requested information and documentation to TEA staff much sooner than the 21 days. So this Chapter 228 update just codifies what is mostly already happening. TEA staff hope this high-level debut of the Chapter 228 makeover has given you tools to review and understand the chapter, as well as answered some of the questions you may have had about the updates. Additionally, I hope EPPs share my excitement and enthusiasm for these long-awaited changes to this chapter. With the understanding that excitement and enthusiasm around the updates to Chapter 228 will be fueled by EPPs receiving clarification and answers to their questions, TEA staff want to respond to any remaining questions you have. Please post your questions in the question feature of the GoToWebinar toolbar so that TEA staff can create an FAQ for the benefit of all EPPs. Others will likely have the same questions you do. You may also have additional questions that come up as you conduct your own review of the updates after this webinar. Please do not hesitate to send your questions to your assigned specialist at TEA. What's next for the implementation of the adopted Chapter 228? EPPs are encouraged to build on what you have. Many of the requirements are either currently in place or are updates to requirements currently in place, So evaluate what you are currently doing and move forward with quality improvements for that point. In other words, engage in continuous improvement of those processes. EPPs are encouraged to continue to engage with trainings and informational webinars that will provide detail and build capacity around implementation of requirements in Chapter 228. Look for notifications of training opportunities in the EPP newsletter. EPPs are encouraged to continue to engage with others in your systems and professional organizations to collaborate on realistic, innovative, and high-quality ways to engage with the rules and meet requirements. And EPPs are encouraged to continue to reach out to TEA staff if you have questions about updates in Chapter 228. Start with your assigned specialist. If your specialist does not have an answer, they will connect you with the person who can assist you. If you hear conflicting information, contact TEA staff who can help you sort through the misunderstandings and find the correct information. On behalf of TEA staff, thank you for taking the time to attend this informational presentation today. We hope you feel it has been time well spent. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again very soon. I'm going to leave the webinar going for a few minutes so folks can capture up the last questions that they have. Please remember to post them in the toolbar on the questions section.